So, Cliff, the film is Bad Tales. What did you think?
I find this quite difficult to know where to start, really, because, yeah, I think the fact that I find it difficult to know where to start is a sign of that the film was very successful. And I think if I start with how upsetting I found the film, I really found this film profoundly upsetting at certain points. The scene where he barbecues the steaks and they're sitting outside, and it's such a lovely suburban scene that I found very, very disconcerting. That scene, how kind of unstable, how volatile the situation is, and the film never lets up on that. The film is like that all the way through. But I guess it really touched me, that scene, because it reminded me of certain experiences in my own life. So actually, I think I had an additional sensitivity to actually what happened, because it really touched me. But I found it really upsetting and horrifying. And there were many scenes like that as well. It's also, at times, it was so seedy and unpleasant. Like when the two guys are talking about the woman outside, and they're just so horrible the way they're talking about her, and the hatred that they have for her. They really hate her. And I just found that really, really hard to watch, really. And then there's a really interesting sequence with the pregnant girl lying on the lounger, when it just focused on her foot and her toenails, and then her smoking, her mouth, and there was just something really disconcerting about that. So I think this was a very unpleasant film to watch in many respects. Now, it's quite interesting, because the last two films we've reviewed, Fire Will Come and For the Time Being, they both had an ambiguity in them. They both had a kind of underlying tension. But the tension was, the films were quite different, but they both had a tension under the surface, not always obvious, ambiguous. This is such an interesting contrast, because again, there's a sense of things not being right, but there's nothing unambiguous about this. And it's so not ambiguous that it's almost caricature. It's grotesque. And actually, do you know what? All the years we've gone to see films, international films, I never really check what the title is in the original language. And I think I've started doing that recently. So the title of this one is Favelace, which is fairy tales. And, and I thought, actually, that's something that's missing from the title, because Bad Tales is not fairy tales, is it? It's because actually there is something of the grotesqueness of a fairy tale and the horror of fairy tales in this. I think it's actually a really good title. But yeah, there's I mean, fire won't come in this film. Fire is here. It's like, really, the whole film is things are going wrong at that. Even when things aren't going wrong, they're going wrong underneath, and you have that feeling. I think it was. It's quite interesting thinking of this as it's almost like there's an Italian genre emerging or emerged, because it did remind me at times of the film Dogman. I can't remember if you saw that film, Dogman, and also the TV series Gomorrah. I think both Dogman and Gomorrah are set in Naples, and they're set in the ghetto, and so it's a very different setting than this, but they're just as bleak and kind of relentless in their in their the kind of pessimistic view of the world. And it also made me think of the Russian film Loveless that we did both see, and you know of Lanthimos as well, of all of Lanthimos's films. And so you know I think, but particularly in the Italian context, Dogman and Gomorrah, that I do find quite interesting. That you know there probably is other work in this genre, and I'd be interested in that actually. There were some moments in the film which just really worked for me. You know, it's like although this in some ways this is a miserable film, I don't, you know, I'm not interested in a film that just pours misery out, you know. But this is a miserable film that kind of has lots that's interesting about it, and kept me interested throughout, and has left me thinking about it afterwards. You know, there were moments when I think that feel quite clever, like when he's in the pool at night and then he gets out, you kind of know he's going to destroy the pool before he does it. And it's like he's unpredictable, but his unpredictability becomes predictable. And I thought that was quite clever how within a relatively short time, the unpredictability of the people in this film, of the people in this life, was almost predictable, you know. And I think that there's a theme there of the whole film that, you know, everyone is living in a way where chaos and volatility are completely predictable. I really thought there was a very poetic metaphor when they're in the sea and the two kids are underwater, and it's a beautiful shot, and it's aesthetically it looks great, and there's a calm because they're in water and they're calm, but they're holding their breath, you know. And you know that if the camera was to stay on that, they're going to have to, you know, explode. They're going to have to exhale or come out of the water. You know, and there's a sense in which that represented the whole film, that the whole film was like all the characters were holding their breath, and at times they would just have to, you know, completely exhale air. And you know, so I thought I liked that. The other moment that really struck me was when the girl that was pregnant was with the father of the baby, and they were sitting in a restaurant, and they were running away together for a new life. There was like a little moment of tenderness, and you know, this film was the tenderness was very spare. There was very little smiling or joy of any sort in this film, but there was like a little moment of hope when they kind of talked about, we need to grow up, and you know, you could get a job and I could get a job and we could have two incomes. And there was like with the music that was on in the background, and then talking about the baby's name, and there was like a little tender moment. But then, you know, they had the coincidence of a certain song coming on, and then next thing she's crying, not just crying, she's like going mad, you know. And it's like I thought that was really, really effective. And it was almost like that was a kind of crossing point from childhood to adulthood, that these were children that were about to become adults. And there was a little moment when they kind of felt that adulthood might be hopeful, but it was quickly dispelled. And I thought that the film actually had a really interesting narrative. You know, we've watched some quite slow films recently. This one didn't feel slow at all. It did feel like there was a narrative, and it had a very clear structure, you know, bookended by the I think it was the same news story. It was the same newsreader reading the story. So it was the film started and ended with the same moment. And obviously you have this narrator reading the diary, that I don't think I mean, I'm interested if you have a view on that, but I don't think we know actually who the narrator is. It's the person who found the diary in a bin. But so at some level, you know, the film's got a very clear structure, bookended by this news story, and you know, narrated through the diary. But it's not linear because clearly you can't reconcile. And I did have to go back, and that's the beauty of watching these things at home. That in the cinema, I wouldn't have been able to go back and watch the beginning again. But at the end, I did go back and watch the beginning again, and watch the first 5 or 10 minutes, and I just pieced it together a little bit more. But you can't actually reconcile it because it's not linear, because they're all sitting, the family is sitting in the living room listening to the story of the pregnant woman having jumped off, you know, killed the baby and jumped off, you know, killed herself. But then the kid, you know, that meets her in, you know, a couple of scenes after that. So, you know, I'm still trying to puzzle that out. And I kind of like that about the film. It's not clear whether it can be reconciled. And I think that in some ways that's a success of the film as well. It's not just a straightforward narrative. Maybe it is, you know, maybe there is some repetition here. Maybe this is something that happens time and time again. Maybe they were different stories in effect, even though they had exactly the same, the circumstances were exactly the same. It was beautifully shot, this film, you know, for such a miserable film. It was really beautiful shot. And, you know, obviously it opens and it's so green, and it kind of keeps that green tone throughout the whole film, which makes it very dreamlike, I think. And but you know, it is a film that's very good to look at. And, you know, I think that's interesting with the, you know, the fact that it's such a miserable film. It looks good. You know, it is very different than those, you know, Gomorrah or Dogman, which are set in very bleak environments. This is quite a, you know, suburban, middle class looking environment for most of the film. And, you know, so yeah, again, I mean, I just think this film was very successful. Obviously, there's a lot of social commentary in this film. I liked the fact that there was a narrative that keeps you interested, but with, you know, which remains ambiguous and leaves me thinking about it afterwards. And, you know, the cinematography was excellent, and the acting was superb. The acting was it felt very authentic. The adults and kids, you know, it always amazes me when filmmakers work with so many children, and they, you know, children can be such great actors. And yeah, so for me, very successful and a really interesting watch.
Oh. Yeah, I agree. It's it had that really troubling, tense, almost despotic atmosphere throughout the whole film. But first of all, I found it very, very funny. Very, very funny. I laughed out loud many, many times. And I think as a jet black, quite cruel comedy, I think it works above any other level that it works on. I found it really, really funny. There were so many things, particularly the bit where they're at the dinner table, and then the fathers are uniformly awful. There's one who shows a bit of love to his son, but that father is completely insane, right? But when he says, "Go and get your report cards, kids," and the kids come back, and they're forced to stand there reading their report cards. You know, history A star, English A star, maths A star, and they go through the whole list, and she gets 1A, and everyone kind of looks at her like she's dropped the ball on that one. And then when the kids are going through the dad's internet search history, that made me laugh so much. And then the little boy and the little girl, when he says, "Hang on a minute, this has gone too far. You're going to have to give me 5 minutes, all right?" And he runs off, and he just disappears in the background, never comes back. So I found some of it really funny, really, really sharp. It reminded me too, it had that kind of weird Greek cinema feel to it, early Lanthimos and Attenborough. And it also reminded me a lot of that Todd Solondz film, Happiness, which has a similar kind of really repellent, ugly cruelty in it. Strangely, I found this film less cynical, actually, and I wonder if that's down to the fairy tale like atmosphere of the piece. Because although it is really difficult in some scenes, and that outrageously so, it didn't feel unpleasant. I didn't find it an unpleasant film, which is perhaps peculiar given how dark the subject matter is. You know, it ends with all these kids committing suicide, and that scene with the father laying in bed, like unable to confront the situation, having found his own children and then just kind of ignored it and gone back to the bedroom. You know, that's a really alarming scene. But I didn't find it cynical. I didn't find that the filmmakers were kind of sneering at me or intentionally trying to shock me. Which is the reason I find it difficult to get on with someone like Todd Solondz. Or so it's a really damning portrait of like toxic masculinity, and as I say, the one sympathetic adult in it is the father, who's just completely off his head. You know, you've got to kind of admire their chaotic lifestyle, but it's certainly not good for the boy, is it? You know, and you can understand why he ends up building a bomb in his bedroom. I agree with you. I think I agree with you about this ending. And this is something I couldn't quite make my mind up on. It's interesting to hear your thoughts on it. I couldn't tell whether at times the storytelling is confused or I just didn't quite follow certain things. So it seemed, on balance, I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to set up this framing device which introduces you into the film. Okay, this is someone's diary, someone's found it, and he, the narrator, is continuing this diary. Because to set that up means that I spend the first half hour of the film thinking, well, who is the narrator and what is he writing? And the question, the statement he makes at the beginning, I can't remember which way around it is. He either says, this is a true story based on a lie, or this is a lie based on a true story. Either way, I never worked out what that meant. And because it's at the very beginning of the film, however immersed I was in what was happening, in the back of my mind, I'm still trying to work that out. Well, what's the lie and what's the truth? And who is the narrator and what's he writing and when? And you're right, at the end, you have this kind of loop, which is not actually a loop because it's irreconcilable. And that's an interesting ambiguity in its own right, but I don't think it belongs in this film. I think this film is so clear and sharp. In the writing is fantastic. It's very, very well written, very, very funny. And I don't think it needed this framing device, which just confused me. As I say, either some of it just went over my head because it was too complicated. Well, either way, I don't think it works in a film. I don't think this film needed that kind of complication. And it's funny that you went back to the beginning, because I did exactly the same thing. When it finished, I went back to the beginning, watched the first minute and a half, and still was none the wiser. I think the diary belongs to the sister of the boy, right?
Yes,
That's the
agreed.
impression it gives.
Because actually we see her behind
a
behind a curtain.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, but we never know who the narrator is. So as a result of that, there's no clear point of view. And there are other moments where stories sort of develop tangentially and then get dropped and never picked up again. Like his kind of relationship with the other little girl, they become kind of vignettes and set pieces that are satisfying in their own right, but they don't have any kind of narrative coherence. Things are kind of picked up and dropped and all the rest of it. But I think because the writing is so sharp, the performances are so good, and it's so well shot, ultimately I didn't unbalance the film, and it didn't reduce how much I enjoyed it, except for this framing device that I don't understand, and I don't really know why it's there. I don't think it does the film any favors.
Yeah, I mean, it's I watched that scene quite closely, because it seems to be the girl behind the curtain, but then it also seems to be I did have to run it back a third time to see this, but just after we see the girl, I think it's shot inside the house, or the kind of mobile home of the mad dad, and you can see outside, like through a curtain, you can see outside the boy of that dad with his wooden gun. You know that scene where he's walking around with the wooden gun, and so we have a flash of that. So perhaps there's a suggestion that he's the narrator, that he found the diary. And
Right.
actually, that's the story. That's the bit of the film that could be, that part of the film could be out of sequence. It might not be in the sequence that we, because we don't actually. He does. Although no, they're going to the party, aren't they? But we don't know it's the same party. I don't think we ever see his son with the other children. And so, you know, I really like all of that.
But
I
what do you
really,
make of this thing where he says, and I don't know which way around it is. He says either this is a true story based on a lie, or this is a lie based on a true story. What does that mean?
well, I think it says this film is inspired by a true story. The true story is inspired by a lie. The lie is not inspired. It says something like that. And it's funny because do you remember a few weeks ago, I can't remember what film we were reviewing, that you kind of objected to films, or you objected in this film to the way it said it was inspired by a real story.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah.
that's what came into my head. So I was a little bit impatient with it, pure not to do with this film, purely to do with the fact that I kind of agreed with you on that film. It was when I went back and kind of really took it in and thought, actually, that is quite interesting.
But what does it mean?
Well, I don't think it, you know, I think I don't think we're necessarily meant to be able to explain everything at the end of this film, you know, and as you talked about, I think it was in our last review, you know, a film doesn't have to tie everything. We like it when a film leaves uncertainties and ambiguities. For me, that's what made I have a slightly different view than you, actually, Joe, because I think that's what makes this film tolerable. The fact that there is poetry in the way it's shot, and that these ambiguities are interesting. I agree with you that it's not cynical. You know, I think that's what I was trying to express in saying that, you know, they're not just pouring misery on us in a kind of horrible way. It feels like it's more than that. It is a miserable film, but it is more than that. It's not cynical somehow, and that's amazing considering how horrible it is, this film, in terms of the things that happen. Where I disagree with you is I don't think it's funny at all.
Wow.
I don't think this is. I would struggle to call this black comedy. I can see. So I didn't think it was funny. I would never have thought of saying that.
I laughed out loud like half a dozen times or more. I thought
I
it was
can see that. I can
really
see
funny.
the black comedy in the points that as you say them, but that did not come across to me. I guess I was so disturbed by, you know, from right early on with that scene at the table. I was so disturbed by the world in which these people lived and the chaos and the uncertainty that these children lived in, you know, that I was never going to laugh in this film, you know. So that's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think the mystery of why he completed the diary, I mean, that's hard to see how that fits, but I quite like it, you know. And that's also quite interesting, isn't it, that he starts writing smaller and smaller because he's running out of space, and he actually goes to look at other diaries, to other books with nice empty pages, and decides not to, and so doesn't write anymore, and just goes back to a boring life of, you know, reading sports magazines and cleaning his car.
I think that's what I found difficult, because that sort of writing, that kind of observation is so good and so compelling, you know, and very memorable. But I don't understand what it means. I don't know who the guy is. And when he says writing the diary, does that mean that the film we've just watched didn't happen at all? It's just someone making it up in a little girl's diary. Is that the point they're making? Because if so, that kind of undermines the potency of the drama, because we're being told from the very beginning, nothing you're about to say actually happened. And if he's not making it up and he's just narrating something that actually happened to him, then does that suggest he is one of the characters in the film?
Yeah, well, Yeah, I mean, they're good questions. My gut feeling is that they are the words of the girl. So it is the narration of a story that's happening in the film. Obviously, when the story runs out, I mean, it is we he describes, the narrator describes finishing off the book, finishing off the writing, and deciding not to write more. So it's like, you know, life had a lot of possibilities. There were lots of empty books that he could buy. Life has lots of possibilities, but he decided not to do it, and he kept reading his sports magazines and soccer transfers, and, you know, and then we see him cleaning his car, you know, and that could have been the end of the film, but it wasn't. We had the scene of them turning up, the dad and the boy turning up at his cousin's in Rome, and it's not clear, is it, whether there's some whether that is, there's some hope there. It's very ambiguous, you know, but maybe there's a little bit of hope. Maybe he is the narrator. I'm going to go back again and look at it again, that opening scene, because I think it possibly is from his, so when maybe he's having a vision of the girl kind of through this curtain, but then he's seeing his own son outside. You know, it does, I think it probably is set in his house when, you know, at the start, when he's describing this process of the diary. So, you know, the fact that you know, they're moving to Rome, and as the kind of end of the film, the epilogue almost, because the film kind of could have easily ended at that point when he washes the car window, you know, that could have, the titles could have come on then. But we get this scene with them perhaps having some new hope. You know, the cousin seems like quite a nice guy, and, you know, who knows, maybe there is a little bit of hope. But then it leaves us with a very ambiguous image of him slightly smiling when he hears the news story of the couple drowning the baby and jumping off the balcony, you know, and so I mean, it's very disconcerting and uncertain, but I really like it for that. And I think that helps me accept it. You know, that helps me enjoy this film. Enjoy is maybe the wrong word, but really appreciate this film, that if it hadn't have had those mysteries and ambiguities, that I would have just found it too unpleasant to watch.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I felt differently. I must admit, usually I quite like, you know, an ambiguous kind of atmospheric, but it has to fit with the tone of the piece. And I think I found overall this film was so sort of clear and sharp that these unresolvable ambiguities just confused me and frustrated me in the end. But yeah, but I think the things we liked, we both liked.
Yeah, absolutely. So highly recommended this film.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
What's next?
Next up is Computer Chess.
Computer Chess. Great. Look forward to it.